Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. With host and founder Richard Case and co-host and retreat leader Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Good morning, Kathy. Here we are.
Good morning.
End Times Friday in April. We, as you see, I have a new library set here. We are in North Carolina at Jake and Mary Beckel's retreat home. We're doing
getting ready for another retreat, right?
Getting ready for a retreat this weekend. These are C12 CEOs and their wives coming.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
And,
that's fun.
It'll be quite fun. They're common, interesting, because when we do retreats, as you know, we do surveys, which are very informative, just for spiritual things. And this particular group, universally, is too busy. And they're not facing many deep conflicts. They just are too busy. They're not spending time together. And,
Right.
and they said they're not enjoying life, but they're busy,
Right.
and they have their businesses are fine, so it'll be interesting to
And
interesting to process
busyness
it.
and joy don't go together.
Right.
Not well.
Right. And it's a hard thing for us Americans, particularly because we are so task driven, and we are kind of driven by the more that we do, isn't that better? And God says no. There's a place of margin and space and time for each other and enjoyment of all of life. That's when we talk about the covenant, by the way. A lot of people try to limit that to, well, you're really talking about prosperity gospel and financial gain, and we're saying no.
No, this is about living life.
It's
and
living the
fullness of what he has for
of
us.
all that God has for us, which is, pleasant marriage, family, inner circle, space, time, enjoyment at work. Excuse me. Wow, excuse me. For financial freedom, and it can be blessing, but that's not the measure. And this weekend, when we have these retreat couples, that'll be the thing that we'll try to let the word speak on its own, is that it's all available to you. God says, I want to deliver it to you, and of course you have to abide with me to receive it, because you got to be with me.
Right.
And there's a joy to that, both from his side and from our side, so it'll be fun to do. So that's why I have a new set today. Next week I'll still be in North Carolina at a different place. We'll be at the Biltmore, and I'll have another set.
Oh, nice.
So that'll be fun.
Yeah, you guys have some fun traveling coming up.
We do. So as we're talking about the end, lots of interesting things going on in the world as we are seeing things. Remember, he said, watch the signs, pay attention. It's very important. And we have to be careful that we don't interpret, and that's kind of an interesting truth, is that he said, watch the signs, and then let me give you insight about the signs.
Right.
Because we can take the signs and say, oh, of course. And usually what happens is people
And we can go on a lot of presumption that's inaccurate.
A lot of presumption, particularly about timing, what it means. And I've been a student of particularly Revelation for like 25 years. And just me personally, things that I understood 25 years ago and interpreted based on what I saw, well, not quite right yet, Rich, because
Right.
there's more, there's more to it. And so think of, here we got 2,000 years of that. And that's why we got to be careful not to overdo it, but also not to ignore the watching of it, because he said watch for it.
Right.
And by the way, there will be a time where it actually happens. So it's going to happen, just like the birth of Christ was predicted, and they waited and waited and waited. It happened. There was a moment in history and the people around that actually experienced it, and even non-believing historians wrote about it.
Right.
Because that happened. So this is going to happen. And one thing that we can say, which we want to talk briefly about, is Israel. Jesus said, when you see Israel form back as a country, the time that generation will see the end. So they have formed as a country. It's possible that we're then in that sequence, and generation will be 40 years. So the next 30, 40 years, is that possible? It appears that things are headed that way just because of the forces we can see with the central banking, and we'll talk about in a minute, and the World Economic Forum. Its goal is one world government, and the one world government is what triggers the tribulation.
Right.
And then Israel, going on, and a couple of interesting things have happened in the last actually couple weeks. Is that the Netanyahu, who is let's say a strong pro-Israel, pro-biblical maintenance of the country, and would be considered and politically would be considered conservative.
Right.
Well, he, because of the way they're structured, a little bit different than ours, and that is that our system, remember, is set up, which, by the way, doesn't really function that way anymore, but by checks and balances with a Supreme Court, a president, and a Congress. And they have to ultimately come to agreement to be able to have things fulfilled. Well, in the Israel system, it's really what's called the Congress, or the Knesset, and then the Supreme Court, and they kind of contradict each other. And because of the law, the way that the Supreme Court can operate in Israel, they can take something and set a policy and say this is it. So
with no check and balance.
Without really a check and balance, and it's problematic structurally. Generally, by the way, the population winds up over time voting, people that they want in those positions to be able to fulfill what their desires are. But because they've had, on top of that, it's not like America where whoever wins the election wins. Even if there were three people running, and somebody got 35%, somebody got 40%, and somebody got 25%. Well, the 40% guy would win. In Israel, that's not true. It's that the majority has to be in power, and if you don't get a majority, you have to go form a coalition of the people that lost to join you.
Which results in a lot of interesting compromises.
Lots of compromises, and is why Netanyahu, for 4 years in a row, had to be reelected, wasn't reelected, couldn't form a government, but because he happened to be there, he stayed in power for those 4 or 5 years. They just did it again. Somebody else won. They did form a government. This is last year. And it collapsed because they couldn't hold it together because, as you said, the compromises that had to be made.
And now we've got protest again because of some of this.
Well, yeah, and so it's not easy to even get to the point where who's ever in power can have their policies be put in power. So as a result of that, Netanyahu fired his defense minister, who is pro-Supreme Court, basically, in their rulings. And these are things about, LGBTQ and transgenderism and all kinds of interesting things that they say are against what they would believe, but the Supreme Court puts it in power. So he was pro Supreme Court. They fired him with an action of, okay, now let's get the Knesset, the Congress, to put together new laws, and in that new law, limit the ability of the Supreme Court to counteract it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that just threw everything in chaos, because obviously now you've got great division. We want this, and the other side wants that, and there's big protests going on.
That's a dramatic shift in how they're governing.
Very dramatic, yeah. So there's a big protest going on. On top of that, and the Palestinians have kind of taken advantage of this moment, there's a lot of violence on the holy sites. And there's attacks going on at the holy sites. And so not only is there protesting, but there's violence contributing to this on the Palestinian side, because they're saying, if we don't go back to the way it was, we are going to have difficulty in being able to govern because of the new policy. So they're not happy. Okay, so that's happening. So there's protesting and no resolution yet, other than disruption and chaos. On top of it, and I think I talked about this briefly, but Iran has been funding basically attacks against Israel. So it's Syria. And these are the Shiites, by the way, the extremists. Right. So the Shiites from Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Al-Qaeda, they're all being funded by Iran to supply them with missiles. And Israel right now is having a barrage from all sides of missiles into the country. Now they have what's called an Iron Dome because of the software system and technology they've got, that they could shoot most of it down, but they're constantly getting bombed by it. And Saudi Arabia, that was Sunni, was basically friendly with Israel, and wanting to make sure that they could actually let Israel come against Iran and keep everything kind of in balance, because they don't want to attack their fellow Muslims, even though they hate each other. It's kind of funny.
Are the Saudi Arabia, is that primarily Sunni?
Sunni.
Okay.
They're Sunni. So it's Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. Those are all Sunni, and they've all been friendly to Israel, but so because of what happened with Russia and fighting Ukraine and cutting off oil to Europe, Europe was requesting Saudi Arabia to not support oil into China and Russia, etc., and don't buy them as well. Well, so the Russians, the Chinese, who are strong partners of Iran, got the Saudis to join them. And said, let's get rid of, by the way, and this is interesting, while they're doing all that, let's get rid of dependence on the United States dollar. And instead of trading in dollars, let's trade in our own currency, which is what they're working toward, separating it out, from it. And then because of that, and Europe gets their oil from Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And they were anti-Russian, but they basically said, "Hey, we'll join you in eliminating oil sales by the U.S. dollar," and they're going to join into the system, even though Russia is a complication for them. So
Europe is
Europe, yeah. This is Europe,
and
this
very
is,
interesting.
and there's protesting.
Okay. And now Saudi Arabia has announced that they are greatly reducing their output of oil as well, correct?
Right. Yeah, to keep the prices up, yes. So it's all economically, and then, by the way, our prices are going to go up. Because
ours already have around here.
Yeah.
As soon as that happened, we saw a spike.
Yeah, they're good at that.
Yeah.
They're good at raising it. So the dynamic we're seeing right before our very eyes, that as little as 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, we were saying it looks like the Middle East is stabilizing, and Israel is a big participant in that, which is
Right.
good for Israel. But because remember, at the end, when we go to the tribulation,
Everyone's going to be coming
everyone is
against
against
Israel,
Israel.
correct?
And so we've just seen in literally a few months the shift of political dynamic, from we're joining together to no, we're not going to join with you, and we're going to basically go this other way, and this other way is going to be ultimately against Israel, and we're seeing it right before our eyes. So we can observe that, and then on top of that, when we look at the banking scenario in the United States, we know this is probably now, by the time this airs, this is probably 6-7 weeks after the
SVB issue.
Silicon Valley Bank collapse, and then others behind it. Well, there's a big number of banks in trouble, which again, all I would urge everybody to do, which is what I've done, is you go online and you can see your bank. And the two questions you're looking for is it being on the watch list, what's called the watch list, and it'll tell you if it is or not. And then you can go to what's called the Texas ratio, which happens to just be a banking information. How is it rated relative to its strength? A, B, C, or worse. And what we want is A banks.
Right.
Well, most of the
You
banks.
said service credit unions are an interesting thing to be looking at right now as well.
And they're part of it, and you got to look at them as well, because some of those are strong, some of those aren't. So, but you can go and say, okay, where do I have my money? Look up the bank, see what the strength of it is, see what the deposit flow is, and if it's on the watch list or it's on a B minus C, I would say even a B or less, B minus C. That bank, and we'll talk about this in a second, is likely to fail.
Interesting.
Okay. And if it's likely to fail, I would urge you to go to God and say, should I move my money to a bank that won't fail in it?
Right.
So that's just per se to look at that. Number two is that because of the inflation rate and the way the feds are operating, is that they're actually tightening the requirements for banks to function in terms of lending and payment of rates, etc. And the prediction is that they're actually going to stimulate, which looks like it may be planned, to take the whole banking system in the United States, probably worldwide, from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of banks, including little regional banks, to just 5 major banks. That's it. And everybody will ultimately have to go to these 5 major banks, only because if your bank fails, and by the way, you and I know Dan had his company was involved with having money in the Silicon Valley. Fortunately for him, the Fed said, we'll honor all the deposits.
Right.
Okay, now, what they do, they say they're going to honor it. What they do is they got another bank to buy that bank. Now, everybody that owned anything in the bank, they're gone. They don't get anything. So they've lost their value in it. But the depositors were remaining whole, and all that
the
money.
The investors did not.
The investors did not. So but now that Silicon Valley Bank doesn't exist, it's owned by another bank. So that as the movement, and this is described and discussed, that over the next year or two, all the banks are going to wind up failing and have to be acquired, and ultimately there'll only be 5 banks.
And so we're going to see a handful of power banks, at least
only
for
5,
a season.
Only 5 major international banks, which, by the way, seems like that supports the new tribulation structure of 10 corporate units, I don't think it's governments at all. I think it's a structure of some other kind that has all the money and all the power, and you can see it being consolidated into control of what must be real, what must be true. So that's happening right now, and it's being written about right now. So when you see it being kind of put out there with people that know, it's kind of like, hey, everybody, you better pay attention, because this is pretty certain that's going to move in that direction. Because this isn't just a wild idea. You can see, and they went through a whole series of what the Fed is doing. And remember, the Fed is the one that's controlling all this and maneuvering all of it. Why? To centralize things, control things, so that the one world government, remember, has to rule the world.
Right.
Well, they have to do it economically. So you could imagine.
Very interesting.
You can imagine, what that looks like, and the aspect of Israel and all that means. And then let's look at. There's a scripture. We were going to go one way, but let me look a different way here.
Okay.
As we go to, let me find this. But do you have any questions at all about just the concept of all that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear all of that. And I think you've already kind of said it, but I'm sure a question that people have is, as you watch this going, what do I need to be doing? And obviously abiding and asking God what you need to be doing. But then from a very practical standpoint, you're talking about really keeping an eye on the banks. And I think that goes one step further, if I'm not mistaken, that, I'm not just looking at my bank, but, I look at like my bank and there's things in the works in the next 2 years for them being bought by someone else. So I need to be looking at that as well. So there's a lot of paying attention that it seems like needs to be happening. Beyond kind of paying attention, is there anything else you would be saying, asking God what he has to say, and then just paying attention as this happens? Is there any warning or advice or anything that you would give anybody as they're navigating, where am I putting my money? How am I investing? That sort of thing. When this is going on.
That, first of all, it's just the source of where you have your bank money. And remember, the Fed, what they say, guarantees up to $250,000 of an account, and that really is, think of it by Social Security number or by what they call EIN number, Federal Identification Number,
for businesses. Yeah,
for businesses, and you can have separate. There's two things you can do. You can have separate accounts under different EIN numbers, so that and Social Security numbers. So, like for example, Linda and I, because we're a couple, we can get covered up to $500,000. Now I could have a.
Now, can I ask about that?
Yeah.
So that's because you have two separate Social Securities. It doesn't have to be two separate accounts.
No, because we have joint accounts, but
That's why I was wondering. So joint account would equate that $250,000 to a $500,000.
Yeah, because they look at what numbers are associated. Well, you got two numbers, so we'll cover you to $500,000, $250,000 each. And by the way, and then I've got a consulting company with a different EIN number, and Linda's got a little company with an EIN number. So those are all separate from that. So we can even be covered greater than that, if we want to. And then two is we could do the same thing at 2 or 3 different banks. So if I have, I go to Bank of America and I've got accounts there, and then I go to Chase Bank over there, same Social Security numbers, but because it's a different institution, I'm covered up to $500,000 at each place.
Separately in each.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating. That's good to know.
Yeah. So it would be, be careful. And this is tricky, and this is why big companies who have millions and billions of dollars, they can't possibly put it in all these different accounts. So
Right.
what they do,
And often they are held, if they have a line of credit with a bank or something like that, they're held to having all of their assets at a particular bank as well.
right? So what they do is they link up with the investment banking community that guarantees it in a different way, and I can put lots more money in that, and then think of, for example, J.P. Morgan, investment banker, owns Chase Banks.
Right.
So if you're a member of Chase Bank, you can say, okay, I'll protect, $500,000 in Chase. I got a lot more money than that. So J.P. Morgan, you take the rest of it and put it in separate accounts through your system and protect me that way. And that's why it's going to be easy, I believe, to consolidate it because of the fear that the little banks are going to be left out because they're not associated with investment banking, and they don't have,
and that offers a different level of protection.
That's right.
Let me ask one more, just for like your average viewer here, average listener, who doesn't necessarily have that amount of money to put in the bank. If they are under that 250 or that 500 threshold that you're talking about, is there any reason for them to diversify into different banks or not, as long as they're under that threshold, so they have FDI insurance to that threshold?
No,
is there any reason to diversify banks for someone dealing with lesser funds than what you're talking about?
Not under the current rules, no. And the only question there is, if my bank is on the watch list or my bank is rated really low, the probability of failure is high. So if I know that, it's not really about,
you want to get to a more stable bank.
Well, I don't want to go through the trauma of not being able to access my money.
Right.
Because there is a period of time where you can't get to it as they sort all that out. And then why go through the hassle if there's a wisdom to be done by moving it to a different place, particularly at least until the tribulation. You can start to realize that there's probably going to be 5-6 banks standing. Maybe I should go ahead and just go there soon, sooner than later.
Right. Well, and that's, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about almost the self-fulfilling here. If, you're talking about them consolidating to 5 banks, which if we all begin to watch and see this one looks bad, this one looks bad, this one looks bad, we may naturally do that ourselves.
That's right.
Cause you start to withdraw, then you put into these that are safer, and suddenly 5 are standing.
Yeah, well, that's what happened think about what happened in Silicon Valley is that there became an awareness that they were financially,
the investments weren't solid,
in trouble, and in one day, think about this, in one day, $42 billion was withdrawn. Well, they couldn't meet it.
Right.
And that took their ratios to negative, and then you have to stop. You literally have to stop because the system says you can't do it. So they stopped, even though people were upset. Now, the people that started it got their money. As you went further down the pike, they didn't get their money. And now it could have been, by the way.
Because it wasn't there.
And this is where, because of the crisis of it, a company like Dan's, who had money in the bank, big money in the bank, interesting enough, if they wouldn't have stepped in, they would have said, tough luck. You just lost $10 million because that's the rule. That's the rule. We only cover this. That's it. They could have done that. And that's where the rub is that it's not that they guarantee that they're going to take care of everybody. It's going to be, I might not, And so it's just, should I be safer with that? And then, the other aspect of it, which we'll talk about next time, will be the economic conditions, which then has a impact on our investments and what we do in our lending and our debt and all these things that we have part of our personal life. We can't assume that the way things are today are going to be the way they are tomorrow.
Right.
And we have to ask God about that and get some awareness of, it seems like it's going this way, just like it seems like my bank may not be stable. Okay, now tomorrow, is that going to fail? Yeah, probably not. Could it fail in the next month, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months? Yeah. Well then, Father, do you want me to do something different? And see, there's no system to that. It's not like, well, you should. It's just that, well, since there's something changing, we urge you to go to God and start talking to him about, well, what do you have to say about this?
And just in that statement, I'm highlighting Rich's saying, go to God and ask him what he has to say, not go to fear and start panicking and figuring it out yourself.
Right. Yeah, because there's neat
Which
answers.
I think is the tendency.
Yeah, and God says, remember, I can make all things work together for good. So he says, don't worry. None of this bothers me. I got answers for you. I can show you. Trust me. And by the way, because of the variability of things, more and more that we can't even fathom what's going to happen. He says, well, I know, and I can tell you if you have a heart to hear, and that's why we talk about abiding. Even these end times are so critical of, even if it's going to be a long way off of ultimately the tribulation, we know that these things are so tricky now.
Right. And we have difficult things to navigate that we need his wisdom on and need him making the crooked places straight. Yeah.
And that's why I think he told us, watch the signs. Yes, in the context of the end, but I think he was saying something even more precise, and that is the signs of your times. The signs of your season, the signs of the economic fluctuations, and the changes politically in governments and all that, and let me give you wisdom, because I can, and I can still deliver covenant life to you in the middle of all that mess.
Right.
So anyway, we'll pick it up next time. Talk a little bit more about the economic things, and then we'll bring back in a little bit more about Israel and then the world situation. So we got a lot to say, and this is our time is up, but we'd like to keep going, and we will next time.
Great. And if you have questions, send them in to questions@afjministry.com. We'd love to talk about them. Thanks for sharing your wisdom on all this, Rich. As always, it's a joy. Have a great day, everyone. See you next time.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by All for Jesus Living Waters Ministry. Send us your questions and comments, and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.